In this section of the course, we're going to think about the end in thinking about kind of the current discussion of climate change and thinking about the end in the context of the conflict between the human and non-human worlds. And within that focus, I wanted to think particularly through a current book, The Great Derangement, by the Indian writer and critic Amitav Ghosh. Ghosh's book wants to think about climate change and its impact on literary studies, and questions about how literary studies itself have kind of ignored or begun to recognize climate change as a force that impacts fiction. So he's thinking here in this book about the ways in which we think about exceptional causality. That, in what ways do we think about the unheard of weather and its appearances throughout the world? Things like wedge tornadoes or Superstorm Sandy hitting the east coast of the United States, or in Ghosh's case, a tornado that hits his home city. And as we kind of think about climate change here, does it kind of bring us face to face with the recognition of the depletion of finite things, Ghosh asks? And how do we as human beings begin to recognize ourselves as geological agents in this new geological epoch that is marked as the Anthropocene, the epoch in which human presence in the world has begun to influence the geological and the geological shape of the world itself. And so these are the kind of basis of Ghosh's analysis in thinking through climate change here. He wants to kind of introduce this sense of the environmental uncanny as an experience in the present world. As he writes in pages 30 and 31, no other word comes close to expressing the strangeness of what is unfolding around us. For these changes are not merely strange in the sense of being unknown or alien. Their uncanniness lies precisely in the face that in these encounters we recognize something we had turned away from. That is to say, the presence and proximity of non-human interlocutors, that we have always been surrounded by beings of all sorts who share elements of that which we had thought to be most distinctively our own, that there are entities in the world like forests that are fully capable of inserting themselves into our processes of thought. So this sense of the environmental uncanny is what drives Ghosh's analysis here, to begin to think about how does non-human presence impact and also work with and within human presence within the world. From grade school and literary studies there, we were taught, the ideas of the different kinds of conflict that were present in literary work. That sense of the human being versus nature as a kind of conflict. Is the sense of the human world versus the non-human world a recovered sense of conflict in this sense? If you start to think about the human relationship with the non-human world and the ways in which the non-human world adapts to human presence, can you rethink that human versus nature conflict as a very present defining force that can be a part of literary thought? This is the uncanny here, can also be perhaps compared to that sense of the sublime that the Romantics spoke of, so often in their work. That sense of the distinction, the slight distinction between an experience of beauty and an experience of horror. A moment of standing on the edge of a chasm and looking down and seeing the beauty there, but also the sense of fear and horror that comes with the sense of a vast space or a vast presence. In what ways is that uncanny kind of reawakened in a similar way here? And Ghosh talks about the idea of looking at a well-known river in his own place and thinking, when I look into my past, the river seems to meet my eyes, staring back as if to ask, do you recognize me wherever you are? Does the non-human world, come back and speak to us in a sense? Does it, command our attention? And how do literary works engage that sense of conflict and encounter here? To recover that proximity of non-human presence, as Ghosh will say, there are several dimensions to this. One is that we need to kind of re-engage ourselves with an experience of something that is broader and older than us. How do we think about the world here? How do we think about the non-human presences that are at work within the world, and our relationship with those presences? Jane Bennett, in her great book on vital materiality, thinks about the materialities of things like metals and the ways in which we think about food, assemblages of things, fungi, and how these things have a vital materiality, she'll say, a presence within their very substance. Ghosh himself will point to a sense of the energy that surrounds us and its kind of purposes that we don't understand. That when you flip on a light and the energy flows, in what ways does that is that understandable to us, and in what ways is that energy's purpose not understandable to us? We also kind of have to rethink here the separation between nature and culture. This is always that we've always kind of put up an uneasy boundary between these things. But in what ways have nature and culture kind of come back together in the present world as we think about the Anthropocene and the climate crisis as a kind of end here? Ghosh recognizes in his work, that the climate has had influence on literary studies before in all kinds of ways. Works like Paradise Lost and Frankenstein were written in periods of strange and quote unquote unheard of weather before. That weather at some points in some places you can see in the works how it influenced the writing itself. And beyond writing in some ways, Ghosh also points to that at some points we need to perhaps move beyond language here, that we need to kind of note the sudden change in the sound of wind through the trees, as he'll note on page 82 in The Great Derangement, that in some ways this is that experience of the uncanny moves beyond words, and how do we recognize that move? In terms of our purpose in the course, right, we're thinking about the end here, and so in what ways, has global warming, worked itself into our imaginations as a kind of end? In the era of global warming, Ghosh writes, nothing is really far away, and so he's thinking about how this globalized world that we recognize is how things are much closer to us because of global warming. The sense of what happens ecologically on the other side of the world has impact on how we are able to live or not live our own lives in our own places. So boundaries have collapsed in a lot of ways, within climate change. The Earth of the Anthropocene, Ghosh writes, is precisely a world of insistent, inescapable continuities, animated by forces that are nothing if not inconceivably vast. And so it forces our imaginations to begin to kind of consider causality in all kinds of ways that are, marked by non-human presences, and how those work with human presence and how those work against human presence in the world, and how do these kind of conspire towards a sense of end? How do you tell this story of the climate crisis? This is one of those kind of central questions in Ghosh's work. And it's a great question, right? Because how do the moral dimensions of fiction here perhaps create subjectivities, such things as characters, right, that may banish our sense of collective human life here? Is it possible for a novel to tell the story of collective life, or do we immediately move into the subjectivity of a character's world as we tell story? Ghosh will ask, how do you narrate human aggregates, that is, human beings' presence in the collective, versus a sense of the individual moral adventure? Some writers that you might know who do this might include a writer like Frank Norris, who has a collection of novels called The Octopus, The Pit, and then a novel that he did not finish but contemplated called The Wolf, where he wrote about wheat as a material force in the early 20th century. So how wheat was grown and transported, how wheat was seen as commodity, and how wheat was seen eventually as product. And Norris was trying to think not about individual characters here, but how wheat itself, a natural product, was a force that animated human behavior. Abdel Rahman Munif did this about oil. He wrote a collection of novels about oil, how oil's history impinges on every life on this planet, according to Ghosh. And as we read Richard Powers later on trees, do we see those? How do we think about trees as characters in the overstory? And in what ways does Powers resist giving them that kind of subjectivity in the narration? And if you narrate climate crisis, note that you have to narrate the breakdown of order here. That it's hard to narrate things that are disordered, but you have to do this as you consider things like climate justice or life on the margins. How climate change impacts the poor in ways that it does not impact those who are able to avoid climate change's impact. And also in terms of refugees' journeys and points of flight, how do you narrate those points of disordered human activity? Do we reach the end here? Right, that's the question in this unit. In what ways, as Ghosh notes, is climate crisis a terminus of history, where we feel the entirety of our past contained within the present? The time has kind of collapsed, and we've reached an end in some ways. Where the Anthropocene is not some imagined other world that is apart from ours, but is the very world in which we contemplate our own sense of end and purpose. I look forward to reading these next works with you and seeing how you understand this interaction of the non-human and the human worlds. Thanks.